Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our event tonight. My name is Leah Lovelace, and I am the Director of Folk Art Education at Vesterheim Museum and Folk Art School. I want to welcome everyone for attending our webinar tonight. We'll get started here very shortly. Just to let you know, we are recording this event and we plan to have it available online, and I'll let my colleague talk about that a little more later. Just so you know, during this event, we invite you to use both the chat as well as the Q&A feature. The chat is more for like, hello, everyone. Or if you're having any kind of challenge and you want to talk to Josh Torkelson or myself directly, you can direct it to Vesterheim Folk Art School privately as a chat. Otherwise, you can say hello to everyone using the chat function. The Q&A function, we are really keeping at for our topic related questions. We will facilitate a Q&A session for the second half of the event using the questions that you submit after our presentation finishes. So without further ado, I want to let you know that we've created this program with the following goals in mind. We want to keep the Vesterheim community connected during this time while we're not open, but we also want to introduce Vesterheim to new friends by offering a forum for discussion and connection, and also highlighting amazing personalities and perspectives from the contemporary folk art world, such as Dale Kittleson tonight. The support for this program is provided by the Iowa Arts Council, a division of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the National Endowment for the Arts through the Federal CARES Act legislation, Silos and Smokestacks National Heritage Area, and the Huebner Education Fund. If you enjoyed this evening's program and want to help Vesterheim continue to offer programming like this, we hope you'll consider becoming a member. And if you're already a member, we would like you to consider making a donation online at vesterheim.org. Especially now during these challenging times, memberships and financial gifts to the museum are especially appreciated. So now, without further ado, we'll get going. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Josh Torkelson, who is the Folk Art Program Coordinator for all our digital learning and outreach programs. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Leah. It's great to be here tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest, Dale Kittleson. Dale is a master timber framer and recently raised our very own timber frame here in Vesterheim's Heritage Park. Dale will discuss his journey as a timber framer and a little bit of the history of timber framing, starting with his own journey, but also discussing Scandinavian style, Norwegian style, Grindbygg timber framing. And he'll also discuss the style he uses himself, the square rule style. Finally, you'll get to see his process in action while he does some video work towards the end of our presentation where he's actually creating the timber frame that you'll see. Then again, that timber frame stands in our Heritage Park right behind the museum, and it will be there for many, many, many years for future museum and park visitors, future plein air folk art classes outside. It has a roof now, and for school and community groups from all over the region. A little bit more about Dale. Dale Kittleson has been a professional timber framer and woodworker for over 25 years. He's taught classes at the Driftless Folk School and at the Wild Rose, his own timber frame workshop near Decorah, Iowa. Some of his favorite pastimes are riding his recumbent bike, spoon carving, collecting Oli and Lena jokes, fixing misfit bikes, and working on projects for his homestead in rural Winneshiek County, where he lives with his wife, Frances. So without further ado, again, here is Dale, and I will start sharing the presentation. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A feature.
Thanks, Josh and Leah. Nice intro.
All right, Dale, how's that look?
That looks great.
Dale, did you remember writing that back when we were putting the catalog together last year?
Yes. Just now I remembered writing.
We're getting a lot of mileage out of that. Thank you.
Good. Don't ask for any Oli and Lena jokes because I don't think they'd be appropriate tonight.
Afterwards, Q&A session, Dale.
Afterwards.
Should we start with this video?
Sure.
I've been a builder and a carpenter my whole life. So I've followed all different kinds of building techniques, spent many, many years as a carpenter, building houses, not being very satisfied with that. It was good work, it was good, honest work, but I didn't feel like what I was building was as good as I felt like I could. And so I started looking at other ways to build. And then I had the opportunity about 25 years ago, a friend of mine who came to town and wanted a timber frame. And so the two of us worked on it together and had a great time. And as we were building it, other people came and heard about it and said, I've always wanted a timber frame. Would you build me one? So we built another one and another one and another one. And the next thing you know, for the next 25 years, we worked as timber framers. So I picked up the work. We learned a lot of it from books and asking other timber framers. There's an Amish community around. We conversed with them quite a bit. We learned a lot of trial and error, figuring things out. The tools that we use, we found that the scale that we wanted to work at, some of the tools we had to make ourselves. And it's very satisfying. It's satisfying to take material like this and put it into a building that could foreseeably last 10 times as long as the tree might have lived. The tree might live for 50 years, 100 years. The building could last 5 to 10 times that.
Is that image coming up for you, Dale?
Yep, I see it now. Okay, well, so my timber frame journey really starts right here with these two guys. On the screen on the screen left is Mark Weber, and on the screen right is Chris Wasta. And we formed Wild Rose Timber Works about 25 years ago. We started when Mark and I had actually been working together for quite a few years before. And then when Chris moved to town and wanted a timber frame and contacted us, and being builders and wanting to do something different, always looking for something different, we said yes. And we started building it. And as referred to back in the video, we soon had other people coming up and asking us if we'd be willing to build them a timber frame. And so we picked up a few more techniques and bought some more tools and learned a few things and started building more frames and created a business doing that full time. So we found that it was a really, like I said, it was a really satisfying way to work. The three of us worked really well together. We made it work as a business and as a lifestyle even. We were able to work together every day in the shop. We built a shop to work in. And then we built Chris's house, and then we built my house, and then we built a number of other places around here. So it was a great start for us to timber frame.
Dale,
I'd say go to the next.
Who is this friend in the middle here?
That's Sasha, my dog. So we each had dogs at different times, and right now Sasha's the only one that's left. So she's still hanging in there. So we spent most of our time when we timber frame, we're in the shop. This was one of the things I really liked about timber framing as compared to being a general carpenter, is when you're a carpenter, you're almost always out on the job site. Summer, winter, rain, wind, hail, doesn't matter. You're out there working. And so most of our time was spent actually in the shop. It was the first time in my working life that I'd ever really worked inside in the winter. I'd always been outside working. That being said, because we were building frames, eventually those frames had to go up. And so we did spend quite a bit of time out on the job site raising comparatively small amount of time, but sometimes we'd spend up to a week raising a frame. This is us working at, Mark and I working together out at the trout hatchery, in a very typical situation, up on ladders, up in the air, trying not to look down. So, okay, next. We did spend, like I said, we spent a lot of time when we were raising the frames, up on the frame. So the three of us worked together as timber framers in the shop, but then we also assembled and stood the frames up, just the three of us. And we had a crane, of course, helping, but oftentimes it was just the three of us. Sometimes we would hire one extra person to help us on the ground or help us up in the air. But as you're seeing here, if you look really close at this particular picture, you can see Chris is actually throwing me a peg. I was trying to put a brace in. I didn't have a peg, and so he tossed me one and I caught it. And this lovely picture was taken mid toss. All right. Go to the next one. Nope, I think you might have skipped one. There. Okay, so this particular one here, we are in the midst of a frame raising where all three of us are manipulating the parts as they come. We would swing the parts in on a crane, and then we would fasten them with pegs as we'd go, and then we would scamper down the ladders and move to the next section and go up the ladders and grab the next piece and send it in. And so it's kind of strange to just see this in stop motion. Usually it was a very slow process. I'm looking at the question here. It's a very slow process. We oftentimes equated it to a baseball game. It'd be many innings of nothing happening, and then suddenly there'd be 2 grand slam home runs right after another. So the frame would be built on the ground and then stood up, and then as the frame raised up into the sky, then all of a sudden you saw the outline of the house against the sky for the first time, and we saw our work go up in the air for the first time. So again, very satisfying kind of work. And I think the next picture was just this. See if we can see it there. Again, the braces, you can see I've got my hand on the end of the brace. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's the tenon, and you can see the hole is already drilled in the tenon, and then the receiving beam right above it is the mortise, and that also has a hole in that, and then eventually those will go together, and a peg will be driven through, and that's what holds the whole building together. All right. We were asked, we often said we never built the same thing twice. We never built the same frame twice. Every time someone came through the door, we didn't know what the job was going to be. We did everything from houses and barns to studios, additions to the kiosk, which is actually out at Seed Savers. They had asked us for a very particular size and style of kiosk that they wanted to have at the entrance. They had redone some things out front. They'd changed where their gardens were, and they'd created some lawn, and they really wanted to have something that would be the first thing that people would see as they drove in. And so again, it's timber framed. It's the same style and technique that we use, but as you can see, it's very different from the last pictures you were just looking at in terms of the scale and the function of it. But we feel like this kind of construction, I've always felt like this kind of construction has a timelessness to it. It isn't dated. It doesn't go out of style necessarily. It has a very it has a very strong presence, and so especially when you're building something like a house that you're going to be staying in, it can give you a really real sense of security, knowing how the house is built, what you're surrounded by. And so in this particular case, they wanted a particular look that would look, it matches some of their existing buildings, and it has a kind of stands on its own as a presence. Okay, next one. I'm not seeing the next one.
It looks like it advanced.
There we go.
Okay, there might be a little bit of lag with
Okay.
internet connections and stuff.
Well, hopefully everybody will bear with us and not disappear. I see there's still 78 people out there, so.
I think
This
you're
is a
getting
barn.
people.
This is a barn that we built for some folks right on the edge of town here. They wanted a very traditional looking building, but they wanted to serve a more modern. He wanted a workshop and garage, and I think there's some kayaks in there. Who knows what's all stored in there now? But it was meant to be sort of a useful building, but one that would fit into their existing landscape and also complement the buildings that are around it. It's near some other rural looking buildings, barns, farm buildings, that kind of thing. And so they wanted something that would fit in with their fit on their lot for one thing, but also serve the purposes that they wanted. And that's one of the things that we tried really hard to do with our business and as a timber framer, was to not sort of impose our vision so much on what people wanted, but to try to give them what they wanted as best we could. So that's what we did here with this particular barn. We had 1 year where all we built was barns. Okay. So now we get into Norwegian. So the style, I'll go back a little bit. The style that I've been showing you is called square rule style of layout. It's the way of creating a timber frame you can use imperfect material, but you can make the parts interchangeable with each other. So as we found that working in our shop, with 3 of us working equally on a frame, we had to be able to each work on parts as we were there and know that those parts would fit. So let's say if I was working on a beam and Mark was working on a post and Chris was working on a brace, and eventually all 3 of those parts would fit together, but we didn't have to fit them together while we were making them. That's the essence of square rule, is you're making parts that you know will fit together and are interchangeable. In Norway, at least in southern Norway, and I'm not an expert by this by any means, but in southern Norway, there was a timber framing, not a very strong timber framing culture, but there was a timber framing culture. And in some particular places, it was known as Grindbygg. There's probably a dozen different timber frame styles in Norway, but this particular one that we're talking about here it used something called the scribe method, where the parts were literally held up to each other. The parts would be laid down on the floor or the ground, and the parts would be laid on top of each other and scribed around and then marked. So that's why it was called scribe technique, is you would scribe the parts to the other parts, the mating parts, and then also you would mark it so that later on you could put it on that spot. It would only fit in one spot. And there's many reasons why these different styles develop, but in Norway, at least in parts of Norway, they had, in the valleys, they had mostly softwood trees, spruce, mostly spruce, some pine. And timber framing, especially other styles of timber framing, developed where there were lots of hardwood forests. So lots of oaks, deciduous trees, and a different style of timber framing developed because they had longer pieces, they had stronger pieces, and so they developed a style that made sense with that. In Norway, they had in lots of areas, they had lots of trees, they had lots of spruce trees, and they had a much stronger log building culture than they had a timber frame culture. So if they needed a house or a building that needed to be enclosed or secure from, for livestock, or be able to heat it, almost invariably they built it with logs. Very seldom, if ever, did they build timber frame structures that would then be enclosed and then heated. So a lot of the structures, like you see in this picture here, they were an open structure with a roof, and so they were used for shelter, for maybe grain or hay storage, or materials, possibly implements, farm implements that they might have had that needed to stay out of the rain. Any number of things got pulled. It was basically the garage of, it's the old version of the garage. Whatever you needed that you put in there to get it out of the weather. That's where it was. You can see on this one that looks like they actually enclosed maybe the sides, nailed some boards up for a bit more protection, but very, very often they were just left wide open. So here's another building. It's almost exactly the same scale, but you can see it's notched logs with a door. Looks like a sod roof, probably. That could have been used for, someone might have lived in that while they were up in the hills tending sheep. Who knows? I don't know the history of that one, but it's obviously built as a much more secure building. Possibly had heat in it, hard to say, but it certainly was secure, having a full door and walls, and a gable, enclosed gable all the way up. So it was definitely meant to be, a shelter that was secure. And again, using logs, they oftentimes did not waste the logs, so to speak, on building a timber frame, or building an enclosed building that was only going to be used for temporary shelter or open shelter. They would use the logs for a more enclosed look. And a lot of times the wood that they used for the Grindbygg, like here, could have been any, yeah, let's go back to that one, that next one. You can see the material here is not high quality. I mean, but this building could be 500 years old. I mean, it's definitely stood the test of time. But the material itself is, most of the pieces are very short. Some of them could have been driftwood, some of it could have been alpine, kind of shrubby kind of material. If you built on this scale, then Grindbygg worked quite well, and was actually was fairly easy to accomplish with very little tools. It didn't take a lot of tools. You could literally build a building like this with a hatchet, if that's all you had. A hatchet and some way to bore holes. Typically they had a few more tools than that, but on a farm, you maybe only had a few tools. You couldn't invest in a lot of specialty tools. So this was a very appropriate way to build. It did not use the mortise and tenon joint. It used more of a series of interlocking joints that could be, like I said, could be executed with very simple tools, an axe, maybe a saw. If you had a chisel, you'd use it, but if not, you'd use an axe, and you could build that with those tools, and it would serve the purpose. It would serve the purpose that it was meant to do. It doesn't necessarily scale up. I have seen some pictures of barns, fairly good sized barns that were built with that technique, but typically what I have seen in my limited experience is buildings this scale, and then the next one I think shows something that maybe is a little bit larger. So this one looks like it has a little more headroom to it. You can see they've enclosed 2 walls with maybe some kind of wattle, which is just woven sticks. And then it looks like even below that, there might be some tin that was nailed up. And that could have been added later. This might have been a shelter that was wide open for a long time, and then they felt like they needed more enclosure. And so it lent itself, this kind of structure as compared to log structure, really lends itself to that kind of thing. It can be wide open if it needs to be. Things could be nailed up to the outside to help enclose it. But like I said, very seldom was a building like this enclosed with insulation, at least traditionally in Norway, to create a heatable space. And if you look at the roofing on that, you can see it's large slabs of slate. And I think that was pretty common too. So here's the big difference between Grindbygg timber framing and square rule. This is the very, this particular joinery right here is very indicative of that style, Grindbygg framing, where the beam, what's called the tie beam, rests down on the posts in that slot, and it rests all the way down to the bottom of that slot. And then the plate beam, then if you can kind of picture those going together, where it says neck on the beam, on the tie beam, that drops down into the slot. And then the plate drops down on top of the tie beam and notches into the ears at the top of the post. And then they've actually, on this particular drawing, there are a couple of wedges there you can see up on that plate. So once it was all put together, then those wedges would oppose each other and force it all together. And then the rafters, it doesn't show the rafters on this one, but the rafters would then be notched into the plate. And so the weight of the roof, we saw on that picture just before with the heavy slates, and sometimes it was sod and sometimes it was a combination of both, that weight would actually push against the plate and lock the frame together. And it was, the building is actually held together by the weight of the roof. That's why they lasted so long. And as long as that piece that's labeled head, as long as that held together, the building would remain standing. So in Decorah, there is actually, in Decorah, there's actually a traditional Grindbygg frame. It's up at Phelps Park. If you've been to Phelps Park, you maybe have never seen it. It's sort of tucked away. But if you go over to where the kiln is, the big brick kiln, that building that's right behind this is the shop. And so the kiln would be off to the left. There's sort of a circular drive as you come in, and this is off to the right, sitting on a slab. And it was built, oh, Leah, help me. Was it built in like 2012, maybe, or was it earlier than that?
You know, I knew I should have looked that date up to make sure, but I think you're right. It's like around that time.
It might be earlier than that, but there was a group that came in. I don't know the whole story, but there was a group it was like a workshop, and they brought in a fellow, I'm sorry, I don't know his name, from Norway, and he led them, and they built this in a traditional style, Southern Norway Grindbygg style, and very similar to what we were seeing in some of the other pictures. This one is much more, is a bit more refined. The timbers are straight. Almost all the timbers are straight and milled, which I think was probably not common with this particular style, but certainly lends itself to that. especially in a workshop situation. So I think you have some more pictures of close-ups of the joinery. We can see some of the, so that's that joint we saw that was all exploded before, the post and the neck and then the plate. And then you can even see a rafter that's notched into the top of that. And if you think about that plate sort of pushing out, the rafters pushing that plate out, but it bears against the post and somewhat against that beam. And the peg is in there just for, who knows why the peg is in there. It's just for added security, maybe for the wind, to keep the wind from lifting it up or something. And if we see one of the pictures of the braces, there's the braces, and you can see 2007. Okay, thank you, whoever said that. You can see the braces are let in to the side, so they're actually the brace would be held up against the post, traced around, then everything inside the line would be chopped out, and then the brace would be put back in once the building goes up and then pegged into place. And that's very different from the style that I have used, which uses a mortise and tenon joint for the braces. Structurally, there's not a lot of difference. There's potentially some difference in the way this brace would resist tension, but because it's dovetailed, there's probably not that much difference in how they would resist that.
So Dale, I just want to share that we have an attendee here, David Susag, who corrected us. It was 2007 when it was built, and David's a longtime friend of the folk art school, so we appreciate you, David, for saving us there. And also,
are you in this picture?
Yeah, the artist was Corin Herfindahl, I believe was the name. So, and
Okay.
someone will correct me if I'm wrong on that too, I bet. But so yeah, continue.
Well, I remember seeing this go up. I watched it go up. And at the time, I think Daryl Henning had actually come to us and asked us about acquiring some of the materials. So I think we helped him with that. But here you can see, if you look close, you can see where the braces will go in. They're the notches that are in the post and in the beam there. And actually, if you look on that beam up top, you can see the notches for the rafters too, where they go in. So it's quite elegant in its own way.
And this next bit here is the video talking about your process here, Dale.
Okay, so my signal is not real strong, and so for me the video is a little bit choppy, so I will try to narrate as we go, but I'll just have you stop every so often and I can explain what's going on. I'll see what I can do. So I always create a model of whatever I'm building. It's an easy way to visualize what's going on for me and also for anyone I'm building for. It's a way between having a model and having plans. You don't really have to have a lot of other detailed drawings. You don't need architectural drawings or many pages of each individual part, because you have those parts in the model, and then as you build, you can refer back to the model to make sure that what you're building is accurate. So the first thing I do is, when I get a stick up on the horses, is I just go over it and look for any flaws. Like right there, I was just pulling out some staples. I look at the timber. Can you stop it for a second? It's going by way too fast. I look it over. I check it for crown. I check the timber for crown, make sure there's no big flaws, make sure it'll work if it's long enough to be the piece that I'm making. And then I'll go through and I'll do whatever I need to do to the timber to clean it up. If it's got a lot of marks on it, I'll sand it. Some frames will actually plane. We'll run a hand plane over it to give it a nice texture. Here I'm using a block plane to just sort of break the edges, make them a little friendlier. This is one of the timbers that will be close enough to the ground that people will reach it. And so I want to make sure that the edges aren't too sharp. And the block plane is just a great tool. It's one you hold in one hand and it just skims along. It has a nice sharp blade in it. And it takes a nice edge off. Now here, this is the square of square rule. This is one of the key components, probably the key component to square rule timber framing, the steel square. What it allows you to do, and what I'm doing here, can you pause it again? What I was doing right there was checking for a square face. And you have to have some kind of a reference face to start off of. And then what square rule does is it allows you to use timbers that are out of square, cupped, crooked, bent, bowed, twisted, whatever, because what you're doing is you're creating sort of a perfect timber inside an imperfect timber. So that timber I was working on right there was an 8-inch by 8-inch timber, but I was actually I'm going to reduce any place I have joinery, I'm going to reduce it down to a 7.5-inch timber. So that was a really difficult thing for me to wrap my head around when I first was learning about it. No one taught me how to do that. I read about it. I saw pictures of it, but I never had anyone explain it to me. And so the first frame that we actually built, we did not do it that way. We did what was called mapping, where you just kept track of the width of every post and the length of every beam and the length of every brace. And you mapped every one of those parts out. And I kept that all in my head. And so as we put things together, we had to make sure that we allowed for a post that was undersized, and then another post that was oversized, and then another post that was undersized again. And by the time you get to the end, you want to make sure, like in this particular case, the shelter is 24 feet long. You don't want it to be 24 feet 3. You don't want it to be 23 foot 5. You want it to be 24 feet. Well, if you are using imperfect material, that those imperfections add up. And so by using square rule, you can allow for those imperfections and still create, in a sense, a perfect frame. So here I am just referring back to the model on this piece before I do the layout work, which is where you draw out the joinery on the piece. So measure for length, check it against the plan, lay out there's tenons, there's mortises and tenons. The mortises in this particular case are for the braces, and the tenons are where it will intersect with the beam or with the post. So right there, I'm pointing to the tenon on the end of the beam. And I think, so just indicating where that tenon is. It's a little hard to see, but once I cut it out, you'll see the finished tenon. And then the mortises are laid out and then drilled. Most of the wood is wasted away with the drill, and then the rest of it is chopped out. So there's just a little clip here of the drill. Will it do it? Here we go. So it's a 2-inch bit, and I line it up with my marks, and then the drill wastes out most of the wood. And then I'll come in with my mallet and a corner chisel, and I'll start with that. And the corner chisel allows me to square up the mortise. Of course, the holes are round and the tenon is square, so I need to square up the mortise. And it's a lot of just, at this point, then there's a lot of pounding. That mallet that you saw is the same mallet I've used for 25 years. So that mallet has probably been swung 16 million times. I don't know how many times, a lot of times. And that chisel is probably 125 years old, if not more. And it's still as good as the day it was made. It's probably been through a few handles, but the steel is still good. So after the corner chisel, then the framing chisel comes out, and that squares up the sides. And I hope this video is a lot smoother for you. So I just waste out whatever's in there until I have a mortise that's the right size. And you can see there's slots there for the housing. So that's where the brace will actually fit down. And now I'm going to clean that housing out. It's been sawn down to a particular depth. And now I will clean that out with the chisel. And there are lots of ways to do this. I mean, this is really an antique way of doing this. Most timber framers do not do it this way. They have routers, computer controlled routers, you name it. Lots of different machines to do this work. But we found as in working with this material that these tools are very appropriate for the scale that we work, and they do a darn nice job. So there you can see the housing is cut and the tenon is cut, or the mortise is cut, and I'm testing it with a pattern, placing it in there to make sure it's deep enough and the actual one will fit. Now this is just a model of a mortise and tenon joint. So every place that you see a peg, when you go and look at the shelter, which I hope you do, and you see it, every place you see a peg is inside of that is that joint, the mortise and tenon joint. So here's the tenon now. It's been laid out on the end of the timber. There's a little bit of waste on the end. So the first thing I have to do is cut that waste away. And I do that with the handheld circular saw. It's a 10-inch blade on that saw, but it's still, all the tools that I use are handheld. I don't have any stationary tools that I run the timbers through. I run the tools over the timber, and then simply remove the waste. And now you can see where the tenon's going to go. I'll take the square and I'll finish laying out the tenon on the end. So again, a 2-inch wide tenon, and at another time, probably a week later, I'll make the mortise that tenon will fit in. And I don't have to go back and check because I already know the size of that. There, I just laid out the housing line. So it's an 8x8, but I'm laying it out to 7.5. And then I'm actually making the tenon itself only 4 inches. So I'll take this big saw, and again, there's a lot of different ways to do this. The way that I do it, I suggest you don't try at home, because I take the big saw and I run it right down, vertically down through that big 10-inch blade, just inches from my belly button. And then I do it again. And then I will roll the timber. And then do the other two faces of the tenon. The tenon's 4 inches long, and so I've got the saw set right at 4 inches deep. And then I cut the housing line. Then I reset the depth to cut the cheeks. And it isn't quite real time, but it's close. I mean, it literally takes about a minute and a half or so to cut out a tenon like this once you've done it a few times. It's very, very, very easy to cut the tenon off at this stage. That's why I mark it out. And then I just knock the waste away, and there's the tenon. The housing piece is still on the bottom there, but that just gets sawn and chopped away. I'm just sort of cleaning up some of the little leftovers here from the saw. This is the housing line here. So I don't know if it showed, do we show cutting that away? I don't remember. So that line right there is the rest of the housing. That's where the beam is upside down right now, but it will go into the post, and that housing will sit on a mate housing on the post. And then the final bit is, of course, making pegs. Now, you can't go to the hardware store anymore and buy pegs. I think you used to be able to do that about 100 years ago, but you can't buy pegs unless you make them yourself. You can, there is a place that makes pegs, but I would rather make them myself. So basically the wood is oak. It gets split out from a large piece of oak stump, and then into inch-by-inch squares, and then shaved down fairly close, and then driven through this plate, and that sizes it. It sizes the peg so that it's not too big. If you drill a 1-inch hole and drive an 1.1 peg into it, you will split the timber. So here's just showing the finished posts and the housing lines. What we were just looking at, that beam is going to fit right into that spot, and then below that is the brace mortise, and that's the beam that we were just working on right there. I think that's the end. Thank you. And I don't remember what's next. Look at my notes.
The Timber Frame and Heritage Park, we've got a few photos here to show folks what that looks like. There's the complete photo and some raising, and we can I'll kind of page through them as you talk about it.
Okay.
Josh, right now we have a blank screen.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't see anything right.
We're envisioning it though, and it's beautiful.
It's it must be snowing.
This is what it'll look like soon, right?
This is what it'll look like in the winter.
do you see this image?
Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
This image doesn't
There.
show up.
We're good.
Okay, so you see the full timber frame?
This is the one of it going up. There it is. There's the full one. So initially, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but initially this was going to be a workshop. I was going to do a timber frame workshop through the folk school. And this was going to be the project. We were going to spend 5 crazy days learning how to timber frame and cutting joinery. And who knows, we might have even stood the thing up. It's unlikely, but we may have. But this is what we were going to build. So because of COVID, of course, we couldn't do that. So I ended up doing it in my shop. But this was the frame. This was the place where the designers and the architects and all the smart people said, this is where we want a shelter. And so near the mill, it's a great spot. I love how it's transformed the spot down there. So this is our process of standing it up. I had Mark come and help me. We did have a crane that we used. So we assembled, these are called bents. Every one of these cross sections is called a bent. We assembled the bents on the ground, used the crane to stand them up, and then we would swing the connecting pieces into place. And then as the connecting pieces, you can see the braces are already there, ready to go. And we would swing them into place and drop them on top of the braces and fit them into those mortises, fit that tenon. That could very well be one of the timbers that the timber that I was working on in the shop right there, the one that's up in the air. And it would come in and we'd drop it in, and then we'd go to the other side, do the same thing, and then finish up the end. And then the roof would go on, and it's supposed to look easy. And there it is with the trees planted around it and the nice courtyard next to it. I can imagine all kinds of workshops happening underneath that space. I've seen a lot of people drive by it already and look at it.
Yeah, a lot of buzz so far, and it's a beautiful,
Yep.
beautiful structure. So lots of fun to come under that structure.
One thing that we found was we had, as I said, we never built the same thing twice. And we had lots of different people come and say, I would really like this, or I would like that. And it might be something that we never would have considered. This particular spot, this is at the, at Ramunji, at the Zen Buddhist facility. And initially when they were thinking about building there, he came to us, Shokin came to us with a plan, blueprint, written in Japanese. He went over to Japan, got a plan, came back, rolled it out to us and said, is this something you could build? Not this particular building, but a very large traditional Buddhist monastery. And we were like, well, I don't know, let's figure it out. And we found out very quickly that it was not feasible to do it exactly the way they wanted it, but they wanted to have something that gave the flavor of a Buddhist temple or structure. And so we came up with these. This is the bell tower that we built. And then there's a gate, a front gate, I believe is the next one, maybe. There it is. So as they come up the path, then they walk through this gate, and you can see it's very heavy timbers. No braces per se. The bracing is all up in the structure. So because in Japanese joinery, they did not typically use diagonal braces. They just used a lot of heavy cross pieces and joinery. So that's what we did. We didn't technically build a traditional Japanese structure, but we found the essence of it and we built that. And then I think there's one more of inside the Buddha Hall. Yeah, so this is inside the Buddha Hall. And again, they wanted a space that would reflect the look and the feel. But the reality was their budget didn't allow for truly traditional frames. So we were able to modify what we do and give them that. And we found that was, again, a very satisfying thing to do, to give people what they want within some kind of a reasonable structure. It's a beautiful thing if you have unlimited funds and you can do whatever you want, but that's oftentimes not the case. So, and in their particular case, they knew what they wanted and they knew how much they had to spend, and we were able to give it to them.
These last 4 images are of your work, Dale, and I'm wondering if, while I page through them, if you can answer some questions that the audience has had. I want to save some of these minutes at the end for some questions. So I'll just page through them, and then if there's a specific slide we need to reference for a question, we'll jump back.
Okay.
Great. I'm gonna kick us off with a question from Paul. And Paul is wondering if there's a difference in the wood species used in pegs versus the timbers.
Yes, the timbers can be just about anything. We found that around here, especially in the Midwest, upper Midwest, most of our frames were built with oak. This particular frame you're looking at is all oak for the framework. There is some pine in the rafters, but the timbers and the beams and the braces are all oak. And we always use oak for the pegs. Oak, usually bur oak, which again, around here, is an very underutilized wood. Unfortunately, you see a 200-year-old oak tree cut down and it oftentimes turned into pallets. So we would take that same wood and turn it into this. So yes, but we built timber frames from pine, spruce, almost all the hardwoods that grow around here. Some oddballs, we've used walnut tops and things. So for the frame, we've used all different kinds of woods, but for the pegs, it's oak, always oak.
Great. And then there's a question about what kind of wood was used for our timber frame, and also about the structures, the posts, bases. Wondering if what has been used for the post bases, and if it is because of local building codes. What would old timers use for post bases to anchor the structure of the base?
Well, interestingly, so if you look at this particular building, this is out at the fish hatchery, out at the trout hatchery. This one is not. This is this is a house, but the trout hatchery, those are anchored. Those posts are anchored down to the concrete with a strap that comes up from the concrete and is inside the post and is pinned into place. The shelter, there were a lot of questions there about the shelter. I remember the base plates. Anyway, the base plates there on the shelter are mainly for wind. So a structure like that is very susceptible to wind. It doesn't have a traditional foundation like on a house where you have a basement. You look at this one, this is literally posts sitting on top of a slab. So those base pieces are fastened down into the concrete. And then if you look really close at them, if you go there sometime and look really close at them, they're actually several parts there. There's a base piece that is attached to the concrete, and then there's side pieces that fit into fingers and then are screwed to the side of the post. And what that provides is a lot of lateral stability and uplift. That roof is like a big airplane wing. So I wasn't too concerned about it sitting right next to the mill there and being in town, but anybody know what's that word? Derecho, right? Didn't that just go through a place, and who knows what could have happened? You know, you get a wind like that and it flows up and over that roof, and what it wants to do is lift that right off the slab. And so that particular base anchor will keep that from happening. Now in a traditional building, gravity was the connection. They're typically, even big barns were not attached to the foundation. They were just set on top of the foundation and gravity held them in place.
So we have a question on I think this is our last question due to time. So Martin Hansen's asking, is there a book on square rule timber framing? Do you have a suggestion about a book?
So a lot of the timber frame companies, when they first started out, some of the bigger ones also held classes, and a lot of them came up with workbooks. There's lots of different timber frame books out there, but most of them follow the same pattern. Here's an intro to timber framing, here's some of the history, and here's how I do it, right? But a few of the places actually came out with workbooks, like this is the book you buy for their workshop. And I would suggest, if you're really interested in learning about square rule, would be to try to find one of those. Fox Maple had a school. I don't know if they still do it anymore, but I think their workbook is out there. You probably will have to look on some esoteric book site to try to find some of these. But if you look for a workshop, timber frame workshop book, that would probably be the best place to learn how to do it. The best place to learn how to do it would be in person, in a class, because like I said, learning it from a book, unless you're very good at picking up subtleties in instructions, or unless you have some kind of prior knowledge of it, it's a difficult knowledge to acquire just from a book.
And somebody is asking, are you going to offer a class at Vesterheim in the future? And I would like to say, I sure do hope so. We were really looking forward to this class. We're very happy that Dale did the solo commission so that we could have our timber frame structure ready
to go.
Yes, because I think it's going to be a valuable classroom next year for us. But yeah, we would like to have Dale come back and teach timber framing. Thanks for your interest. Josh, I'm going to toss it to you for thank yous.
Well, I'll wrap this up by saying, first of all, thank you all for attending, and a big thank you to Dale. If you have access to the emoji feature to give a clap, go ahead and give Dale a clap here. And a big thank you here to Leah and Dale both for kind of hatching this idea. It's been so fun to get to delve so deeply in a craft and to see so many different traditions. I also want to just do a quick shout out to our collections, exhibitions, communications, and marketing teams who have provided a lot of support in getting these images together and getting those videos together. And also there were a few images that the timber framer Peter Henriksen put together for us. So those are the Grindbygg photos from his website. So I want to credit him on those. And there are a few questions about a recording of this presentation. We have been recording this presentation and it will be available on our YouTube channel in approximately 2 weeks or so from today, and we'll notify you when that goes up. Please know that our next folk art conversation event is in December, on December 15th, and it's also at 7:30 to 8:30 Central Time. It's going to be such a wonderful conversation. It's with master woodworkers Phil Odin and Elsie Bigton and master rosemaler Patty Goke, and they're going to be discussing their work at Disney's Norwegian Pavilion at Epcot. So it's going to be a riot. It's going to be such a good conversation where the three of them are talking about just amazing work that they did recently for the remodeling of the pavilion for the Frozen work. So we also have several upcoming collections connections events where we look at objects in our collection and our folk art instructors come together. We have one on telemark style rose mauling, Norwegian coverlets, setestall style rose mauling, carved spoons, and so much more. We have monthly book prats or book groups that are coming up, and a few that are in collaboration with Luther College. So check those out. And of course, all of these events you can find online on our website if you look up Folk Art Online. We hope you'll join us for some of those. The last thing I'm going to leave you with today is after the event, we're going to send out an evaluation. We're still learning with you, and these events and digital offerings are so new to us all. So we're trying to figure out how do we make them most effective for all of you, and what would you like to see? If you have suggestions for programs, we'd love your thoughts. So I'll send that out after our talk today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Leah, Dale, do you have any closing thoughts?
We have to give a shout out, Dale, to our two little creative guys.
Gus and Josh. I hope you're still watching. Now go to bed.
That's right. And we love Josh and Gus. They joined us for our family adventure too. So our recent one. So anyway.
Well, everyone, I want you to know that the Zoom platform is a little abrupt. So if it just cuts off on you, that's sort of the nature of the platform. But we're so thankful that you joined us today, and we'd like to give you a little wave, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dale.